He would ride the elevator all the way to the bottom floor of the high-rise apartment building that he lived in. But when he came home from work, he would only ride the elevator up to the 6th floor. And then he would get off the elevator and take the stairs to his apartment many stories higher in the building. And this he did every day, unless it was raining. If it was raining, he would ride the elevator all the way to the floor of his apartment. Why? Well, here's another one to think about. Anne is lying on the floor dead. There's a broken glass and water all around her. And Stuart is asleep on the couch, seemingly oblivious to the death that has just now occurred. How did Anne die? Did you ever play those kinds of mind games where you're presented with a scene and then you have to figure out what happened to make that scene the way it is, asking questions that only can be answered with yes or no? Well, just so that you won't be trying to figure those out the rest of the morning, instead of listening to what our main topic is today, I'll tell you the answers. In the first one, the reason the gentleman would go only to the 6th floor on his return home from work was because that was the highest button that he could reach on the elevator control panel. He was a short man. But then on the days that it rained, he had his umbrella with him. And so he could just use that to punch the button that indicated his floor. The second situation, it might help you to know that Anne is a fish and Stuart is a cat. And the glass of water all around Anne on the floor is from her fishbowl that Stuart successfully knocked over. So let's try one more. On Friday night, a man dies. He's buried on the same night. On Sunday morning, some friends arrive at his tomb where he was buried to pay their respects, only to discover that the body is gone. What happened? That's the situation that we're going to look at this morning. In John chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, it says this: Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Now, if you read the Gospel of Mark, it tells us that 5 women came to the tomb where Jesus' body was buried, and that there hadn't been sufficient time after the crucifixion to properly prepare him for burial. And as they got closer, they thought, who's going to roll away the huge stone from the door of the cave? In spite of that, they continued, and when they got to the tomb, they found that the soldiers guarding the tomb were lying on the ground, looking as if they were dead. And so they walked past the soldiers, they went into the tomb, and found the body gone. Just then 2 angels appeared and proclaimed to them that Jesus had arisen. They were told to go and tell the disciples, so that is exactly what they did. And then in the Gospel of Luke, it tells us that when they got there and began to tell them about what had happened to them, the disciples didn't believe them. It sounded just like a bunch of gibberish to them. Guards that seemed dead, the stone rolled away, men in bright clothing, Jesus alive. None of it made any sense to them at all. But 2 of the disciples, John and Peter, they go to the tomb to see for themselves, along with Mary Magdalene, to see if they can figure it all out. The tomb was empty, and no one doubted that. But what they needed to decide for themselves was why was it empty, and what it all meant. And that, my friends, is exactly what you have to decide. We all agree that there is an empty tomb. You wouldn't be here today if you didn't believe that. But the question is, how are you going to respond to the empty tomb? How is it going to affect your life? 3 different people came to the tomb that day. And each one of them responded in a different way to the empty tomb. So let's look at how each responded. First, there was John the believer. The first to arrive at the tomb was John. In John 20, verses 3 to 5, it says, "So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. And both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the stripes of the linen lying there, but he did not go in." You see, when John heard the news, he just jumped up and ran with all his might to get to the tomb. He wanted to believe. He loved Jesus. Of all of the disciples, he had been the most faithful one. He had been there in the courtyard when Jesus was interrogated and sentenced to die. He had been there at the foot of the cross when Jesus died and hung there dying. He had willingly taken Jesus' mother into his home and cared for her. He was so excited about the possibility that Jesus might actually be alive that he ran faster than he ever had before. But when he got to the tomb, he didn't go in. He looked inside, saw some of what Mary had said was there, but he stayed outside. Maybe he stayed outside because he had to catch his breath after the long run. Maybe he stayed outside because he was afraid. What if Mary was wrong and Jesus' body had been moved to another part of the grave? He didn't want to see Jesus all mangled from the torture of beating and the cross. What if he and Peter were inside the tomb and the guards who were there were just hiding somewhere and all of a sudden they appeared? It could be that this was all an elaborate trap set up by the Roman officials. They had just taken Jesus' body away to lure the disciples there. Once the disciples arrived, they'd arrest them and say that they caught them trying to steal the body of Jesus to make it look like Jesus had risen from the dead. And then after a few minutes, Peter arrived at the tomb. In verses 6 to 8 it says, "Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the stripes of the linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen." Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. You see, we have brazen Peter. He comes and he walks right in without the slightest hesitancy. He saw everything just as Mary had said. The linen that had covered Jesus' body was all neatly lying in place, like Jesus' body had just dematerialized from inside the clothing. And when Peter arrived and entered the tomb, John figured that it must be okay to enter. And so he went in too. And they both saw all the evidence, but they had different responses to the evidence. Verses 8 and 9 says he saw and believed. He still did not understand from Scriptures that Jesus had to rise from the dead. The minute John went in and he saw, he believed. The empty grave, that was enough evidence for him that what the other women had said was true. Jesus really had risen from the dead. John didn't need to see Jesus to know that Jesus was alive. He had heard Jesus' prophecy about his coming death and resurrection, and now here was the empty tomb. That was enough. Some of you here today are like John. You just believe because there's an empty tomb. And because there is the testimony of Christians throughout the centuries to the fact that Jesus is alive. We don't need to see to believe. We join with John in being the ones who Jesus spoke of only a few verses later in that same chapter when he said in John 20:29, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." John reacted to the empty tomb with belief. The second is Peter, the skeptic. Peter. He was a little slower than John to arrive at the tomb. Maybe it was because John was younger than Peter. Or maybe it was because all those years of fishing had given Peter arthritis of the knees and the back. Or maybe it was because he too was afraid of what he might find. He wasn't afraid of soldiers so much. He whacked off the ear of one of them when they tried to take Jesus. Peter wanted to see Jesus, but there was a part of him that dreaded the idea. The last time he had looked into the eyes of Jesus was just after Peter had denied him 3 times. If Peter saw Jesus, he knew that he was going to be confronted with his sin and his guilt. He wasn't sure that he could handle that. Peter's vision was clouded by the pain that he felt over his past. He wanted Jesus to be alive, but he didn't know how he was going to be able to face it. Well, maybe some of you here today are like Peter. You want to believe, but there's just too much history. You've got too much pain. You feel like Jesus won't be there for you because of your history. And so you don't accept his love, and you don't respond. It's just too difficult to believe that Jesus' resurrection could wipe away all that pain. But let me tell you something. Jesus can forgive, and Jesus can heal. Peter went in, and he examined the evidence for himself. He saw the linen that had wrapped his body, and a piece of cloth that had been around his head. It was enough to prove that something had happened there. But it wasn't enough to prove that Jesus was alive. Another account of this event in the book of Luke says that Peter was wondering to himself what had happened. He was a skeptic. He needed more evidence. Then Peter did one of the most foolish things of his whole life. In verse 10 it says, then the disciples went back to their homes. He left. Something as important as that. And he left